J.D. Vance silences an arrogant journalist. His reply leaves the studio speechless. J.D. Vance feels in control when a journalist asks him pointed questions about his background during live television, but in a twist, nobody saw the whole dynamic flips coming. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from. Now imagine this. The studio turns on Blaze on one of America's most popular talk shows. The air is electric with anticipation as J.D. Vance, our recently appointed vice president, enters the set after taking the oath of office. Vance exudes the quiet confidence of a man who has nothing to hide and everything to prove. But Marcus Bennett, the show's host, has other ideas. Bennett is known for his witty remarks and liberal views. Despite his producer's assurance of a civil conversation regarding the new administration, Bennett has been preparing for this moment for weeks. However, the sparkle in his eyes shows a different. However, the customary pre-interview chit-chat is hurried and robotic as Vance sits down. Bennett's grin never quite reaches his eyes, and there appears to be extraordinary tension among the filmmaking crew. Drawing on his experience in the Marine Corps, Vance anticipates an ambush and knows that Bennett's inquiries are full of concealed traps. Bennett answers the first question with a smile on his face, but Vance can't help but observe how tightly he holds his interview cards. Mr. Vice President Bennett starts off by speaking in an artificially pleasant tone. Let's discuss your outstanding from Trump's detractors to his second-in-command. Vance smiles back, his eyes displaying the knowledge gained from a life of struggle. The audience leans forward, taken aback by the lack of defensiveness in Vance's response. Bennett shifts in his chair, and he says, "Lessons, Marcus. That's actually a perfect place to start because it speaks to something bigger than politics. It speaks to the American capacity for growth and understanding." Abruptly losing its edge in terms of development and comprehension, Bennett makes fun of his tone, which is full of disdain. Is that what we're calling it? Some may argue that it's just political expediency, but you see Marcus Vance responds firmly that Americans have a habit of reconsidering our positions when new information is offered. Years ago, when I attacked the president, I had a limited perspective, but later I saw something extraordinary. I briefly witnessed his program start to benefit the forgotten Americans I write about in my book. Bennett's facial expression slightly tightens. Vance keeps looking straight but unchallenging, so allow me to ask you a question. Marcus, have you ever changed your mind about something significant? Have you ever considered the data and come to the conclusion that your first assessment may have been incorrect? Bennett's silence drags on a little too long. We're here to discuss your adjustments. Speaking of changes, Mr. Vice President, who is not shuffles his cards as though he is ready to launch his next attack. Bennett goes on. Let's talk about your most recent remarks at the National Breakfast of Prayer. You mentioned that God guides government decisions. Do you not think that's a risky combination of church and state? The audience tenses. Vance had been waiting for this exact challenge, as evidenced by the sparkle in his eyes after Bennett just walked on holy ground. Divine direction. Marcus Vance leans forward and speaks with conviction. What I really said was that our founding ancestors recognized the need of moral leadership and that they were terrified of dictatorship rather than faith. This caused the gathering to resound with, "Amen, Bennett's jaw tightens, but in our diverse modern society, he starts, only to have it softly interrupted as Vance raises his hand. It's crucial that Vance's tone stays the same, so let me finish my notion. Forceful, but courteous. As presidents have done throughout our country's history, I put my hand on the Bible when I took my oath of office, not because we're creating a state religion, but rather because we understand that God, not just the government, is the source of our liberties." Bennett looks to his producer, who is watching closely from the sidelines, and then Vance adds his voice with a thought-provoking note. "What's intriguing is no one questioned our chaplain's presence when I was a Marine, Marcus, and as a result, the discussion intensifies an unexpected clash of beliefs that leaves the audience thinking about not just the current problems, but also the nature of growth, understanding, and wisdom that transcends generations. No one voiced any complaints when we prayed. Bennett's face flushed before missions, because even the skeptics realized there was something more profound than politics during those moments of truth. Let's talk about your relationship with President Trump. Your recent claim that he is God's tool for America's renewal struck me as a little extreme. What I considered to be extreme, Vance calmly responded. He paused to allow his words to settle over the silent studio. But since you brought up President Trump, let's talk about results rather than rhetoric. Let's talk about what's actually happening in our community since the inauguration. His unwavering demeanor is how some members of the media seem more dishonest and more concerned about a leader who prays than about policies that hurt American families. Calm, with Vance's constant presence and measured reactions temporarily stifling even Bennett's signature quick-fire interruptions. Bennett's poise started to falter. Let's discuss your history. You wrote about your humble beginnings, Mr. Vice President. But now that you're seated in the corridors of power, some could argue that you've forgotten your origins. That's fascinating. Marcus Vance responded equitably because, in my culture, people are judged on their character rather than how well they conform to the expectations of the Washington elite. Bennett sneered, "Is that what you call this complete reversal on Trump?" "Yes, I did, and you know what takes more character to admit when you're wrong standing up." The audience mumbled in agreement, for what you believe in even when people like you twist it into something else. Bennett pulled at his collar in an ascension-laced tone. "Mr. Vice President, you have established yourself as a spokesperson for Americans in the working class, so why are you wearing a fancy suit to defend a billionaire?" As some audience members moved uneasily, the room's warmth seemed to decrease, but Vance's face stayed the same, with a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "You know what, Marcus? I see someone who believes that a man's beliefs may be altered by an expensive suit. Let me tell you something. These values are the ones I inherited from my grandmother in Ohio's Middletown. Keep your job title and zip code the same." Bennett's eyes narrowed. "So you're implying that your change has nothing to do with your desire for political office, and that we should disregard your previous criticisms in favor of accepting you as President Trump's new—" He stopped and let the word hang puppet. It hit the room like a hurled gauntlet, and several people in the crowd let out audible gasps. Vance's reaction was delivered with the accuracy of a professional chess player. "You know, Marcus, the word puppet tells more about you than it does about me." His voice was measured but steely, and he suggested that perhaps having a strong sense of commitment to someone you respect is something to make fun of, but let you learn to judge a person's character by their actions rather than by what the media says about them. I can tell you this because I witnessed President Trump's character firsthand, not the caricature you and your colleagues created, and the audience erupted in applause. He leaned forward slightly in combat. Bennett attempted to interrupt, but Vance persisted. "When I see actual leadership, I call it that, and yeah, I'm honored to serve with President Trump. You call it being a puppet." Bennett's tone was full with irony. "A man with your level of education should recognize the irony of endorsing someone you've previously attacked." Marcus calmly said, "You're so intent on seeing contradictions that you're completely missing the purpose. The true contradiction is disregarding what I have personally witnessed in order to appease self-deprecating critics." There was a roar of applause after he spoke. Bennett turned to face his producer, who was making frantic gestures from the sidelines. But Vance wasn't done. "Since you mentioned my intellectual background," he added with a small smile, proving that true wisdom isn't determined by finding contradictions, but rather by having the capacity to learn and develop. "Why don't we discuss the intellectual dishonesty in your coverage of this administration?" Marcus Bennett responded with a tone that was tinged with accusations from my coverage. "We're here to talk about it, bluntly." J.D. Vance seamlessly interrupted because you spent a whole piece last week casting doubt on my beliefs, implying that it was merely convenient Christianity for the election season. Bennett's expression changed when I pointed out the timing he began. but Vance leaned forward and interrupted him. I was just trying to clarify that I've been going to the same church since before I got involved in politics. Or maybe you want to doubt my grandmother's faith as well. She taught me to pray before every meal, even when we didn't have much to say. To be clear, a woman in the front row nodded enthusiastically at what he said. Marcus Vance went on to speak. All simply existing in the past, a definitive hush descended around the studio as Bennett struggled with his papers and his meticulously constructed persona started to fall apart. You're attempting to salvage this interview, Mr. Vice President. But he muttered, no. I'm trying to have an honest conversation about the disdain you and your colleagues seem to have for ordinary Americans, Marcus Vance said steadily. You invited me here in the hopes that you could shame me for my beliefs, my background, and my support for the president. But let's talk about what really bothers you. The studio became silent as all eyes were on him, which irritates you. Vance went on to say that it irritates you that someone can come from where I come from and not share your perspective. I can still be an ed.UC at Yale Law School and maintain traditional values. And more importantly, it annoys you that I can see right through the game you're playing Bennett's attempts to reclaim control. Your allegations are Vance's expressions hardened for the first time, but they're not accusations. Marcus, you made remarks like rolling your eyes when I had previously mentioned prayer or making fun of my hometown. Trump's rebuke on your show last week was like a thunderclap, leaving the audience in stunned silence. You see, this isn't about politics. Vance kept his voice firm but controlled, and it's about respect for faith and traditional values for the millions of Americans who don't require your approval, consent to support their president, or to love their nation. Bennett's face went pale as he looked at his producer, who was now watching the conversation with a mixture of interest and worry. It was obvious that the interview had deviated greatly from Bennett's intended ambush. Maybe we should move on. Bennett started looking at his watch, which I noticed he had been doing ever since we began discussing faith and values. Vance smiled slightly and said, "This is uncomfortable territory for you, Marcus." Marcus laughed a little. For someone who takes pleasure in hard-hitting journalism, Bennett's uneasiness was evident as the audience rose. Bennett attempted a final attack, but Vance continued, "You seem remarkably eager to change the subject when the conversation doesn't go your way." Is this the same type of diversion you employed when you went from condemning Trump to applauding him? Marcus Vance gently responded. You keep returning to that, so would you mind answering a question for me? Have you ever had your opinion of someone shift after getting to know them well and witnessing their actual nature, rather than depending solely on stories from the media? A senior citizen in the crowd yelled at him, "Mr. Vice President, you know what the real story is here. It's not about my past criticisms or my current position," Marcus Vance said with confidence. "It's about something that terrifies you and your colleagues, the fact that someone can think for themselves and change that. Their opinions based on first-hand experience and maintain their convictions in the face of constant criticism from the media." Bennett started to perspire noticeably. "Mr. Vice President, you're misrepresenting me." As a result, the debate hung in tight balance, with the truth exposed for everyone to see. "Marcus, I'm merely displaying a mirror." With composure, Vance interrupted, "And I don't think you like what you see. A journalist who came here with the intention of embarrassing me ended up exposing his own biases and turning to speak directly to the audience. You see, Marcus doesn't realize that true integrity isn't about never changing your mind, but rather about having the guts to own up to your mistakes even when others like him are ready to jump in. When I first met President Trump, I had a choice, and even several members of the production team nodded in accord. I could have held on to my assumptions, or I could have evaluated him based on his deeds and sincere love for this nation. But I chose truth over pride, and your network might want to try that sometime." Vance kept speaking with a quiet authority. Bennett cast a last-ditch glance at his producer, who quickly slashed his throat, sending a global signal to end the session. And you know what else, Marcus? The American people are fed up with being disparaged for their religious beliefs, fed up with having their morals ridiculed, and fed up with the entire studio audience was on their feet in a moment, because journalists believe their role is to tell people what to think rather than to report the truth. Bennett's meticulously planned ambush backfired miserably, drowning out his attempts with deafening applause. Bennett cleared his throat. His demeanor completely collapsed, and he muttered, "Well, I think we're about out of time." Vance agreed, getting up from his chair. "But before I leave, I'd like to say one last thing to the American people watching at home." He turned to face the camera, his expression genuine and resolute, and he said, "What you've witnessed today isn't just about one interview or one journalist's attempt to discredit me. It has a lot to do with, more importantly, it's about sticking to your principles. They believed they could make fun of my faith, make fun of my support for President Trump, and make me apologize for holding to traditional values. However, they fail to realize that these aren't just political stances. They are the values that shaped America, the truths that will lead us forward, and the principles that kept us strong during difficult times. In the end, character isn't about gaining the favor of others." So Vance straightened his tie and stood erect in front of every American who has been made fun of for their beliefs, ridiculed for their morals, or told they're on the wrong side of history. As Vance walked off the set, he emphasized the importance of keeping loyal to one's beliefs to the audience. Rose received a standing ovation that shook the studio. Bennett's planned ambush was foiled by unwavering principle and quiet strength, proving that dignity and truth are the best responses to arrogance and bias. If you enjoyed this story about standing firm in your beliefs, please like and subscribe. Remember that faith, family, and freedom are the foundation of everything we hold dear. God bless.